All right, so today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be diving deep into some notes and tips that we have for a Linux admin interview.
Oh, very cool.
So this is kind of tailored for someone who's prepping for that interview and wants to know what kind of questions to expect and how to really nail those answers.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to make sure you're not just giving the right answer, but you understand the why behind it.
Exactly. You want to stand out from the other candidates and really show that, your stuff.
Right. Anyone can memorize commands, but you want to show them you understand the system inside and out.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute basics.
Yeah.
Our source material mentions commands like lsec, pwd, touch. These are like the bread and butter of the command line.
Yeah, for sure. Those are the building blocks. Like you said, bread and butter, you got to know these.
But I think it's interesting to think about why those commands are designed the way they are. Like, what's the philosophy behind them?
Well, the Linux command line, it's all about efficiency and modularity. Each command does one thing well, and you can combine them in so many ways to do all sorts of things.
Like with ls, you list files PAD, you change directories, and with PWD, you see where you are.
Exactly. Simple but powerful, right? When you start combining these commands, that's where the real power comes in.
And if you understand that underlying philosophy, it makes the whole command line a lot less intimidating.
Absolutely. And it'll help you learn new commands faster, too, because you start to see the patterns.
Now, another command that our source mentions is swash, which is for connecting to remote machines. That seems like a must-know for any Linux admin.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, these days, almost every server you're going to work on is going to be remote, so swash is essential.
Okay, so we've covered some of those basic commands, but let's move on to file management and permissions. This is where things can get a little bit tricky.
Yeah, permissions can be confusing, especially for beginners.
Our source material mentions MKS, which is used for creating file systems. Can you explain what a file system is and why we would need to create one?
Sure. So a file system is basically the way that data is organized on a storage device, like your hard drive.
Okay.
When you get a new hard drive, it's just a blank slate. It doesn't know how to store data.
Right.
So you use MKFS to create a file system, which basically sets up the structure for how data will be stored.
So it's not enough to just plug in a new hard drive. You have to actually format it with a file system.
That's right. You have to tell the operating system how to use that space on the hard drive.
Got it. And once you have your file system set up, you need to manage files and permissions.
Mm.
Our source talks about using LNSS to create symbolic links, and then there are those file permission codes.
Yeah.
Like the first 3 bits being for the owner.
Yeah, those can be a bit cryptic.
And I always get a little confused with those.
It's easy to get bogged down in the numbers, but remember, permissions are all about security. They control who can access a file and what they can do with it.
So, like, if I set the permissions wrong, I could accidentally prevent myself from editing a file, or even worse, allow someone else to access it.
Exactly. Or you could have a situation where a web server can't write to its log files because the permissions are wrong.
Okay, so it's not just about memorizing the codes. It's about understanding how they impact the security of the system.
Precisely. And that's what interviewers are looking for. Can you think about the bigger picture and understand how these seemingly small details relate to real-world scenarios?
Speaking of real-world scenarios,
Mm.
our source material also has a bunch of troubleshooting questions. Like, what do you do when you get a permission-denied error, even though you're sure you should have access?
Ah, the classic permission denied. That's a good one.
It's happened to me more times than I can count.
It happens to everyone.
Mm.
And it highlights the importance of understanding not just file permissions, but also ownership and groups. Sometimes the problem isn't with the file itself, but with the directory it's in. Like, you need to execute permissions on a directory to even enter it.
Ah, so it's like having a key to your apartment, but the building's main door is locked.
That's a great analogy. You own the file, but you need permission to get to it.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about another troubleshooting question? What if you can't find a crucial file, like the Apache configuration file, httpd.com?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So what would you do if you were in that situation?
Honestly, I think I'd panic and start clicking around randomly.
A lot of people would.
Don't worry.
Don't worry. But in an interview setting, you want to show that you have a more systematic approach. Remember those foundational commands we talked about, like find or locate?
Right.
You can use those to search for the file in a more organized way.
So it's about problem solving, not just knowing the magic command to fix everything.
Exactly. Interviewers want to see that you can think critically and use your knowledge to diagnose and solve problems.
Okay, I'm starting to get the hang of this.
Yeah.
But there's one question that really terrifies me. What do you do if the system crashes and you get the dreaded operating system not found error.
Whoa, okay, that is a scary one. But it's designed to test your understanding of the boot process.
So what does that mean?
If the operating system can't be found, it usually means something's wrong with the bootloader or the boot partition. You'll need to show that you understand how those components work together to get the system up and running.
Okay, I see. It's not just about fixing the problem. It's about understanding why the problem happened in the first place.
You got it. That's what separates a good Linux admin from a great one.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from basic commands to troubleshooting. But there's still so much more to Linux administration, and our source material has a ton of information.
It does. We've only scratched the surface.
So let's dive into some of those more advanced topics and see what other gems we can uncover.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So one topic that caught my eye was NTP, for keeping the system clock in sync.
Ah, yeah, NTP.
Why is that so important for a server? I mean, is it really a big deal if the clock is off by a few minutes?
It can be, actually, especially on a server. Imagine, like, your logs are all messed up, your scheduled tasks are running at the wrong time, even things like authentication could break down because the timestamps don't match.
Wow, I never thought about that.
It's one of those things that you don't really think about until it goes wrong. But when it does, it can cause a lot of headaches.
So understanding how to configure NTP is really about making sure the server is reliable.
Exactly. You want to make sure that the server is doing what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Another topic that seems kind of advanced is mail server relay configuration. I know what a mail server does, but relays are a bit of a mystery to me.
So think of it like this. You write a letter and you put it in your mailbox.
Oh.
The mail carrier picks it up and takes it to the post office.
Right.
The post office then sorts it and sends it on its way to the recipient.
So the post office is like the relay.
Yeah, basically. A mail relay is a server that's authorized to forward emails on behalf of another server. It helps to ensure that emails get delivered properly.
So why is it important to configure these relays correctly?
Well, if a relay is misconfigured, it can be abused by spammers to send out junk mail, or it could be used to send malicious emails that look like they're coming from a legitimate source.
That sounds bad.
Yeah, it can be a big problem. It can damage the server's reputation and get it blacklisted.
So it's all about security again.
Security is a huge part of it. You want to make sure that your mail server is set up in a way that prevents abuse and protects your users.
This all kind of emphasizes how important security is in general for Linux admins.
Oh, absolutely. Security should always be top of mind. It's not something you can just ignore or hope for the best.
And that brings us to firewalls. Our source material mentions firewalled, which I think is the standard firewall tool these days.
Yeah. Firewalled is pretty much the go-to firewall for most Linux distributions. It's a really powerful tool for controlling network access to your server.
So it's like having a security guard at the door, checking everyone's ID before letting them in.
That's a good way to think about it. You can set up rules that determine which connections are allowed and which ones are blocked.
So I can block certain IP addresses or only allow certain ports to be open.
Exactly. You have a lot of control over what's allowed in and out of your network.
That's cool.
It
But it also sounds kind of complicated.
can be. But once you get the hang of it, it's a really powerful way to protect your server from attacks.
Our source material also mentions scripting, which always seems a bit intimidating. What kind of scripting should a Linux admin know?
Scripting is super useful for automating tasks and managing complex systems. You don't need to be an expert programmer, but even knowing some basic scripting can save you a ton of time.
Like, what kind of things could I automate with scripting?
Oh, all sorts of things, like backing up files, cleaning up log files, restarting services. Anything you do on a regular basis, you can probably automate with a script.
So it's like having a little robot assistant that takes care of all the boring stuff.
Exactly. And the more you learn about scripting, the more you can automate.
Okay, that actually sounds kind of fun.
It is. It's like solving puzzles.
Yeah.
You figure out how to get the computer to do what you want.
Now, one thing I'm a little confused about is the etcetera_stab file. I know it has something to do with file systems, but I'm not sure exactly what.
Okay, so the etcetera_stab file is basically a table that tells the system how to mount different file systems at boot time.
Mount.
Yeah, mounting a file system means making it accessible to the operating system. So like when you plug in a USB drive, you need to mount it before you can access the files on it.
Oh, okay.
The etcetera_stab file lists all the file systems that should be mounted automatically when the system starts up.
So if I messed up that file, the system might not boot properly.
Yeah, that's possible. If a critical file system isn't mounted, the system might not be able to start up.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, another concept related to file systems is NFS, or Network File System.
Ah, yes, NFS.
I see it mentioned in our source material, but I'm not really sure what it is.
So NFS is a way to share files over a network.
So instead of copying files from one server to another, I can just access them directly over the network.
Exactly. It's like having a shared folder that multiple computers can access.
That sounds convenient.
It is. But it also comes with its own set of challenges, like security and performance.
So a Linux admin would need to know how to set up and manage NFS shares.
Absolutely. And they need to understand the security implications of sharing files over a network.
It seems like with every new concept we uncover, there's a whole new layer of complexity.
That's the nature of Linux. It's a powerful and versatile operating system, but it also requires a deep understanding of how things work.
Well, I'm definitely learning a lot from this deep dive. And it's making me realize that there's so much more to Linux administration than I initially thought.
There's always more to learn. That's what makes it so interesting. You're never really done.
All right, well, let's keep going. We still got a lot more to cover in our source material, and I'm eager to see what other challenges and insights we can uncover.
Let's do it. I'm ready for the next challenge.
So speaking of troubleshooting, our source material also had this question about a user who can't write to a file, even though they own it.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one. It's not always as simple as it seems.
What do you mean?
Well, it could be a permissions issue, like we talked about before,
That's right.
but it could also be something else entirely. Like maybe they're trying to save the file in the wrong directory, or they accidentally changed the permissions themselves.
So a Linux admin needs to be a bit of a detective sometimes?
Yeah, you got to figure out what's really going on. Is it a technical problem or is it user error?
And I guess you need to be able to explain things to users in a way that they can understand.
Absolutely. You don't want to make them feel stupid. You just got to be patient and helpful.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Hmm.
From basic commands to file systems to networking to troubleshooting to scripting. What else is in this Linux admin interview cheat sheet?
Well, there's a section on scheduled jobs using cron tab. Have you ever used cron tab before?
I've heard of it, but I'm not entirely sure what it does.
So cron tab is used to manage cron jobs, which are basically tasks that are scheduled to run automatically at certain times or intervals.
So like if I wanted to run a backup every night at midnight, I could use a cron job for that.
Exactly. Or if you wanted to clean up log files once a week, you could set up a cron job for that too.
That's pretty cool. It's like having a personal assistant who takes care of all the boring stuff.
That's a good way to put it. And it's a really important skill for a Linux admin to have because it frees up your time to focus on more important things.
Right. Now, another thing I see in our source material are commands for checking memory usage and CPU usage, like free and top.
Yeah, those are essential tools for monitoring system performance. You got to keep an eye on things like memory, CPU, disk, space, network traffic, all that good stuff.
It's like being a doctor for your server.
Yeah,
You got to make sure it's healthy.
exactly. And if you see any warning signs, you got to know how to diagnose and treat the problem.
So let's say I see that the CPU usage is really high. What would I do?
Well, the first step is to figure out what's causing the high CPU usage. Is it a particular process that's running amok? Is there a hardware problem? Once you know the cause, you can start to troubleshoot it.
That makes sense. Now, our source also mentions service management, like using System Pastel to start and stop services.
Yeah, System Per Tool is super useful for managing all the different services that run on a Linux system.
What kind of services are we talking about?
Oh, everything from web servers to databases to mail servers to SSH servers, pretty much anything that runs in the background and provides some kind of functionality.
So if I wanted to restart the web server, I could use systemtidal to do that.
Exactly.
Right.
And you can also use it to enable or disable services so that they start or stop automatically at boot time.
That sounds really convenient.
It is. It makes managing services a lot easier.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a handle on this service management thing. But there's one command that always makes me a little nervous, sudo.
Ah, yes, sudo, the command that gives you superpowers.
Yeah, that's the one. I know it's used to run commands with root privileges, but I'm always afraid of messing things up.
It's definitely a powerful command, and you need to be careful with it. But it's also an essential tool for any Linux admin.
So when would I need to use sudo?
Anytime you need to do something that requires root privileges, like installing software, modifying system files, or changing network settings.
And how do I make sure I don't accidentally break something when I'm using sudo?
Well, the first rule is to always double-check your commands before you hit enter.
Right.
And the second rule is to only use sudo when you absolutely need to. Don't just use it out of habit.
Okay, good advice. Now, our source material also has some questions about dealing with corrupted file systems. What happens if a file system gets corrupted?
Well, it can cause all sorts of problems like data loss, system instability, or even a complete system crash.
Yikes, that sounds bad. So what can you do about it?
There's a utility called Flosk, that can be used to check and repair corrupted file systems.
FLOSC. What does that stand for?
File system consistency check.
Ah, okay. So it's like a mechanic for your hard drive.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. It can scan the file system for errors and try to fix them.
But what if FLOG can't fix the problem?
Then you might be in trouble. You
Yeah.
might need to restore from a backup or even reformat the hard drive.
Okay, so it's important to have backups just in case something like this happens.
Absolutely. Backups are essential for any Linux admin. You never know when you might need them.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly informative. I feel like I've learned so much about Linux administration.
Me too. It's been fun going through this cheat sheet and talking about all these different concepts.
I think I'm actually feeling a lot more confident about that interview now.
Good. I'm
Yep.
glad to hear that. Just remember to relax, be yourself, and show them that you're passionate about Linux.
To you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has helped you on your Linux journey. Remember, the world of Linux is vast, and there's always something new to learn. Explore, experiment, and never stop asking questions. Until next time, keep on learning.